All right, I'll get started. So, hello everyone. Today, I'm going to be leading a workshop for raising money for startups, specifically how to get funding to continue operations and grow. This is going off of the previous workshops we've had about the startup experience and building one. And now that we've talked about how to launch your product and how to market things, we can talk about raising money for it. So, as always, make sure to check in. Here's the check-in code. Get some points at acmucsd.com. And first, I wanted to start off with what the importance of like raising money is, even though that's kind of a given. But every startup needs some sort of financial capital, and I'll be going into like the different ways that startups can get that and like just like the range of that. But in general, a mindset that people have when it comes to entrepreneurship and startups is to think of it as being iterative. You're continually looking for a combo of opportunities and resources and sort of testing how to get information at low cost in a short period of time. So for startups, there are different sizes and different types. So with that, obviously there'll be a different like combination that works for that specific startup about like how much money they need or like what resources and opportunities they need. So for the different types of funding, you have to find what works for you. And the first one I wanted to cover is self-funding. So self-funding is when you're using money from your personal savings or retirement funds. And that's if your projected expenses add up to be manageable. So some startups out there, could be started with like a small team, like a group of friends or like an individual. And if they have the resources they need to like get their group running, then self-funding is a good option for them. But obviously, it's a bit risky because you risk losing personal savings. And then with self-funding, people often reach out to like friends and family and loved ones. So you can also lose their money and trust, which gets a bit messy. But the benefit of it is that you get to retain ownership over your business since you're the one fully funding it and in control. Another way startups get money is crowdfunding. That's when you're using a platform like Kickstarter or Indiegogo to collect donations in exchange for eventual access. So the way that works is you donate for like a free item, discount code, or like acknowledgement, just something that individuals can get, like some sort of tangible thing, or like even like a mention on like the website or whatever. And then in exchange, like people help like fund your startup. And it's good for business to consumer companies with like physical products because then they can get like an early release of a product. And it's also good for startups that, again, are trying to retain control since people that invest through Indiegogo or Kickstarter aren't necessarily getting like equity or a stake in the company. Another way that startups get money is a small business loan. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's just applying for a bank loan. You'll need to pay back with interest. And with this process compared to like Indiegogo, Kickstarter, or just like personally funding yourself, you have to prepare certain financial and business documents beforehand. One of those business documents is a business plan, which is something that's pretty standard for any startup. But then there's also like other documents that you need. And when it comes to applying for a small business loan, make sure to look at like interest rates and terms and conditions. That's like the only thing that will vary among like banks. And then lastly, and this is what I'm going to talk about for like a majority of the presentation, but venture capitalists and angel investors. So this is when you're receiving funds from a firm or individual investor in exchange for a share of the company. So ventures typically need like outside investors, and this is why a lot of startups like choose this method or eventually like grow to choose this method. But with like receiving investments in exchange for like a stake in a company, you obviously have to prepare necessary documents like the business plan I was talking about, and then I'll also talk about later about like a pitch deck and everything else that's needed. And just in general, like this process can take a while. It's really hard. There are plenty of startups out there that try to get funding, and only a very small amount of them do. Um, and that's because investors are like putting forth their money because they believe in your company. So they then own a stake. So when you actually have some sort of worth, they can get their money back and they can have a return on investment. So people, I did say that people normally like go for like investments and like venture capitalists, but you have to find what works best for you. While those are very popular, they're also difficult to navigate. Obviously, if you have your own resources, or if you can get a loan from the bank, or if you can get people to support you on Kickstarter, then that would be much easier than having to like navigate getting a venture capitalist to believe in you. But in general, you have to personalize your strategy, seeing which investors to pursue and how to contact them, but then also just exploring the different options available. And then on top of that, then exploring the options available within that type of funding. And also, just to finish things off, learning the process and how it works. I'm going to be mainly talking about venture capitalists, but all those other processes I talk about have a lot more going for them. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about finding the right investor, specifically like determining what type of investor you want and how to go about that. So there's two different types of investors, angel investors or VC, which is venture capitalists. So venture capitalists, they pool money from individuals, institutions, and corporations, and then invest in those companies on their behalf. So I included like an example there, which is Sequoia, which is a really like popular and big one, but they're managed by general partners and venture capitalists, and like all those people do is just talk to different startups, see which ones are worth investing in, and then put forth that money that's not necessarily theirs. While on the other hand, angel investors are individuals or some groups of individuals that invest in companies on their own. And with that, angel investors are known to invest like smaller sums because it's not like a bunch of people coming together or like a lot of money coming from different areas. Instead, it's like a smaller sum, but since they're an angel investor and they're an individual, they're known to take chances on early stage startups. So how to approach one, whether it's like an angel investor or a venture capitalist, make sure to research the firm or individual. There's different types of investment firms out there, and they can specialize in certain like industries or types of startups. So researching beforehand is good. Or if it's like an individual and they used to work in like high tech or at a certain company, you can get to know them. Each investor is different, so you have to find where your startup will have like a good fit. And in general, like throughout the process, communicating clearly and leveraging your network is really important. Now that I've talked about like how to get funding and then also like the different types of like investment opportunities there are, I want to go into how to prepare and how to get ready to get those investments. Before I start off with that though, there's like two different types of rounds to understand when you're getting like a venture capitalist to invest in you. And that's the pre-seed round versus like actual seed funding. So pre-seed rounds are known as like friends and family rounds. And this is a larger risk for investors because it's really early in like the startup stage. And during this investment, it essentially is a loan that turns into equity, but it's like for smaller sums of money. While like actual seed funding is for like larger sums and for more developed startups, like when they're longer or they're farther into the process. So that could range from like $1 million to even like unicorns that get seed funding for $1 billion. And by that time, like startups have clearly identified a product market fit and they have a strong team going for them, which is why they're able to get so much money. But back to preparing, what you have to prepare, there's two essential things that are needed. And while preparing that, obviously you're gonna have other resources that you make available and other things that you realize in the process. And we kind of talked about it in other workshops before, especially like the how to pitch workshop. But the two that you have to prepare are at least a business plan. So with a business plan, that's just going over how much money you need, where it's going to go, and how long it'll earn to get back. There's a lot of like technicalities and like specifics to that. Especially like there's templates out there and different things people say to add to a business plan. But those three things are like the essential things that any investor is looking for. That's just what they're trying to understand. And then on top of that, a pitch deck sort of visualizes this and condenses it and makes it more clear. And this is also essential to submit because when you hopefully get to talk to an investor, you're going to have your pitch deck and then your business plan ready. And then your pitch deck is what you're going to show them. There's plenty of examples out there. I led a workshop before about like pitch decks and good pitch decks and how to pitch, but those are the main two things you would have to prepare. All right. So now I've talked about like how to prepare for investments and then like the different types out there. I want to talk about like just some general tips for talking to investors, and also to determine like what type of, oh, that's a typo. But yeah, tips for talking to investors. The first one is craft a clear and concise pitch. Uh, these investment firms see plenty of startups come and go, so you have to try your best to stand out. There's even examples online of like great pitch decks or like things that people did during their interviews and meetings that made them stand out. But the main thing that you can do to at least make sure that your pitch comes off as good is keeping it short, but then clearly communicating your idea, its value, and why it needs funding. As I said, there's plenty of existing examples, and making a business plan beforehand is good because that'll provide the inspiration for the actual pitch and also help you have like direction for the startup. The next tip is to articulate your product's value. So investors look for ideas that address untapped opportunities. So if you're able to show them that there's some market that hasn't been explored or there's some product that solves a problem that that doesn't exist today, then that's something that you need to be able to articulate and show to that investor because that's an opportunity for them. Um, Again, explaining what opportunities your ideas taps into is essential, and then further like talking about like audience size and makeup also helps investors see those opportunities. And this is what helps differentiate you from like other companies out there because if you're not able to clearly explain what your product's value is, then they might think to themselves that there is no value in your product. One way of thinking that people have, like people think that if you explain what job customers hire to do, um, like with this way of thinking, like people think that, oh, like customers don't just buy products, they hire it to do jobs. So if you explain what job customers hire it to do, then you're able to explain the value of your product. The next tip is to tell a compelling story. So being backed by data is good, and you should definitely have like a lot of data out there to support like your product and what you're going to do with their money. But that's not everything. Being able to personally connect, relate, and like for investors to feel like invested and connected to your story and to your startup is much stronger. Like having that emotional connection. And if one way that like people are easily able to get like inspiration for a story is to go with like the product's origin story. Um, Plenty of like existing companies and startups have interesting origin stories about like a problem that they noticed or somehow they came up with a solution. So the origin story is always a good one to go with. And going into depth and talking about certain characters and events helps add to that experience. Um, The next tip is to explain what funding would provide. And this is one of the things, like the three main things that I've been talking about, just explaining what you're going to do with their money. Uh, this is important because you want to be upfront with what you're asking for. Otherwise, like it can get messy later on. And since investment firms obviously deal with plenty of startups, they'll see right through it. Specifically talking about like how it'll enable you to do certain things like, oh, we'll be able to hire more employees, we need to buy these materials, we need to set up manufacturing, and breaking down like the ROI, that's like a key buzzword that they're going to listen out for, which is the return on investment. Uh, on top of like just adding like detailed financials is a good way to just further explain, what funding would do and what it can help for your company. Lastly, this tip kind of goes along with like doing research on investors beforehand, but highlighting the investor's like appeal, like what made you reach out to this specific investor. Usually a lot of startups just apply for different things and just try to get their way in no matter what. But if you're able to talk about like, oh, I realized that since you're involved, you invest a lot in companies that are involved with like semiconductors or something, like finding what industry they work in or seeing like what connections they have and being able to talk with that shows like a connection that your startup has and you have as like an individual to that company. And then also like talking about like why you versus someone else would benefit if you have that connection or if you're able to understand like what industry they're involved in and have like that background, then you can talk about like why you would benefit versus someone else who doesn't have that knowledge or that connection. Um, and then this is just like in general with like getting investors, but the impact of the right investor. So it's, as I started off with, like in the beginning, like even though with like getting money, like that's the main thing that people want with startups. It's not just about the financial gain, but there's also a personal gain from it. With investors, they can support, give you advice, like get connections for further things. Even if your startup doesn't work out, but later on you create some other project, those connections are really valuable. And if you're able to get like investments at top firms, then that adds credibility to your startup. And then lastly, it can also just help your business take off in general without just like a financial gain. This is a short presentation. That's all I have for today. But yeah, thank you.